One of the major objections to the Bible lies in the issue of slavery. Surprising how often that issue comes up. We find it in comments on videos. We find it in general conversation with critics and with skeptics. So here we're going to look at what the Old Testament says about slavery and bond service. There's a different video about New Testament slavery that's available on this channel as well, and there'll be a link in the comments if you want to go and look at it. So let's begin by looking at the context of biblical slavery. And the thing to remember is that it happened a long time ago. If you think about the time between now and the birth of Jesus, well, we're living a little bit after 2000 AD. Jesus was born somewhere around 4 or 5 BC, so little more than 2,000 years ago. Abraham, the start of the sort of main stories of the Old Testament, in history of the Old Testament, lived about 2,000 years before Jesus. So he's as long before Jesus as Jesus is before us. And it's well worth thinking about that when you try and put into context the things that happen in the Old Testament. So Abraham and his family, they lived in the land of Canaan. They were nomads. And after a while, they went down into Egypt, and there they stayed for about 400 years. So there's 4 centuries in Egypt. And during that time, they become slaves. We don't know exactly at what point they were enslaved, but they would spend a century or more, probably several centuries, as slaves in Egypt, where they were used to build cities. And then they escape from Egypt. There's the event of the Exodus, where they get out into the Sinai desert. They get to Mount Sinai, and there they receive the law of Moses. And the first parts of that given on Moses starts with the 10 Commandments, and that's within a year of having left Egypt. So the first people who received the law of Moses had been slaves only a year before and had escaped from slavery. The law has extra bits added to it, and there's a restatement of it in the book of Deuteronomy given just before they entered the promised land. That's 40 years after the Exodus. Everybody who had been 20 years old or older, with a couple of exceptions, had died in that 40-year period. So anyone who was 40 or between the ages of 40 and 60 would have been a child in Egypt as a slave. Anyone younger than that would have had parents who were slaves in Egypt. So we're talking about people who knew what slavery was like, and there they are receiving the law of Moses. Well, the law of Moses regulated life in the desert, but it really looks forward to when they settle in the land of Canaan, which they do, and they're there for some centuries before they go off into exile in Babylon, when they are effectively slaves again. But a remnant returns, and they stay in the land up until after the birth of Jesus, until the Romans expel them from the land in the war, the end of the war of 66 to 74 AD. The main defeat and main expulsions being in 70 AD. So the Old Testament spreads out from shortly after the Exodus up until about 420, 430 BC, when it comes to an end. And the life that's regulated is life, the rules are for living in that period of time. New Testament, of course, is quite a bit later, 500 years after that, that it's written, that is. And that's at the time of the Roman Empire, which is a little bit different. So the Old Testament, the law of Moses written in the Bronze Age, gives over to the Iron Age, but the Iron Age is still going when the Old Testament is the last bit of it is written. The Roman Empire comes into the Middle East a bit before the time of the New Testament, but the people that received the New Testament were living in the Roman Empire. So think about the context for the Old Testament law, which is what we're thinking about. When that law was written, they were still in the Bronze Age. no iron implements, or one or two from meteoric iron, but they'd be very precious. Normally, the metal implements will be made of bronze. The economy, when they finally settle in the land of Canaan, they have an agricultural economy. Each family would work a small holding, they would grow crops, they would keep animals. That's what they would live on. They would use the crops and the animal skins and so on to make clothing. They build themselves houses, but it's a small scale economy. The land couldn't be sold permanently. Your land belonged to your family. You'd leave it to your children, but it wouldn't become sold to somebody else. The land can only be owned by a small family, because every 50 years there's a jubilee and the land goes back to the family that originally owned it. So you couldn't build up a big estate. Someone couldn't get a bit rich and buy the next door property and gradually expand it until they were owning a huge amount of land with the need for lots of agricultural labourers to work it. They're talking about something which is a plot that's worked by a family, and that's the way the economy works. And the last point about it is there's no money, there's no coinage. Coinage isn't invented until the Persian period. It's right up here that the coins are first invented. You've got a barter economy. Now, sometimes you'd weigh out silver or you'd weigh out gold. That's only happened occasionally if you're very rich. Happens for big transactions. It happens things like dowries for weddings, possibly. But a lot of the economy goes on is going to be in barter of crops, animals, cloth, things like that, being swapped for other goods. It's not a money economy. Definitions. Important to define what we're talking about. And the first question is, what do you mean by a slave? We're talking about slavery. What is a slave? And a dictionary definition would say something like, a slave is somebody who is in a condition of servitude. Someone who belongs, I suppose, to a master. It's not a very helpful definition. It's saying a slave is someone who's a slave, because unless you define servitude as well, other than the condition of being a slave, then you haven't got very far. So it's someone who belongs to a master. Typically, he doesn't control his release. The master might choose to release him from his condition, but probably not very often would that happen. And the slave serves without any real hope of being released. And we're used to the idea of slaves who had no rights at all. So if you were a slave in the United States before the American Civil War, then you had no rights at all. You couldn't complain about your treatment from your master. If he killed a slave, there was no comeback. The slave couldn't act as a witness in a court of law, and so on. So they had no rights at all. And this idea of slaves in the United States before the war, or the Civil War, is a picture that tends to sort of resonate in people's minds. When we think of slaves, that's what we tend to think of. And they lived a dreadful life. They worked all the hours there were. They had no rights. They were kept in poor conditions, and they had a miserable time. And that kind of slavery was hugely evil. The trouble is that it isn't necessarily always what slavery is like, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. There's also the idea of a bondservant. A bondservant is someone who works a contract that he cannot break. It might be a fixed-term contract. You can think of examples of people who do that. An apprentice, for example, he was bound over to a master, typically quite a young teenager, although it got later and later and later. And he had to work for that master. He was brought up in the trade. He was trained, but until he was 21, he was working for that master, and the master could do almost anything to him. But he did have rights. It wasn't quite as bad as being a slave. In fact, he wasn't anywhere near as bad as being a slave. One that really isn't bad at all is an association footballer. He is contracted to his team. He could move from one team to another if he is sold. And there's a transfer fee. Again, people complain. They say, well, the contract that's sold, not the player. Well, the player goes with the contract. That's just a sophistry to try and get around it. So there are people who are bondage servants for various reasons, and there you go. There's a sort of subset. Slaves are a subset of bonded laborers. They're a particularly unfortunate set of them. Slavery is not a good thing, but they are a subset of bondservants. In the Old Testament, there is no distinction between the two. The same word, ebed, covers both a slave and a bondservant. That's a male one, or one way you don't know the gender. It's amma if it's a female servant. So slavery is a bad thing. Keeping slaves is not a good thing to do at all. It's wrong. But the question is, what makes slavery wrong? And if you ask sort of postmodern critics and so on, the people who get very upset about slavery, then they would say, well, slavery is wrong because it's wrong. You're saying slavery is an evil. It is, but they haven't said why. And that is the standard reaction you get. That's what postmodern people talk about. But it's an extremely shallow definition. It doesn't say why one should consider slavery to be an evil thing. Better reason for saying that is because slavery impacts the well-being of the slave. It's cruel to the slave. They are working dreadful hours. They are unable to choose what to do. They're unable to go to another master. That's what makes slavery so bad. But supposing you change that, supposing you get rid of these evil effects, is slavery as evil in that case? Would you need to abolish slavery, which was actually good for the bondservant in terms of his conditions? Interesting question. You have to think about it. Another point, sometimes the law of Moses has to regulate things that are definitely not good things. And we've got an example here with the law of divorce. Someone's asking Jesus about it, and Jesus says, no, you shouldn't. Divorce is a bad thing. That's something that goes back into the Old Testament. Malachi says the Lord hates divorce. But there's a law in Deuteronomy as to how to manage a divorce. So why is it there? Well, it's there because what's going on is that the law is saying, don't divorce people, but if you must divorce someone, this is how you do it. It's regulating something which is very much considered to be a bad thing. So that's a comment on divorce law, but you could apply that to other issues where you're saying, well, what you're doing is a bad thing, but you could have the same, you're going to do it. So what you can do is, if you're going to do it like this. And that suggests that the law of slavery is something like that. Now, I hope I've been clear there. I hope we've set the framework well. Let me know if you think I haven't. Put it in the comments, and I'll see what I can do about answering the problems. So let's look at some individual features of the law of Moses. The first thing is that in the law of Moses, a slave had rights, or a bondservant had rights. And the first one is that he wasn't considered to be below his master. For most people, for most kind of slaves, there's this huge distinction between the master and the slave. But the point of the Old Testament makes over and over again, 16 times in the law of Moses, a couple more times outside the law, is remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. You mustn't forget that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and you're only a step away from the slave that you own. So it's something that makes them very sensitive to the issues of slavery. They couldn't forget it. The law said you mustn't forget it, and they were permanently reminded if they ever read the law. Second point is that there is a duty to look after other people. The law required them to do that. Jesus quotes it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and then the example is your neighbor is anyone you come across. And the law of Moses, further on down the same chapter, explicitly includes foreigners. Leviticus 19 verse 34, you shall treat the stranger who stays with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And so in Egypt, when they were strangers in Egypt, they were slaves. And that's not one of the 16 times either. That just says you were slaves in Egypt, sort of indirectly, but you have to think, you have to treat them, you have to think about them, you have to treat them with respect, you have to treat them kindly. On top of that, there are specific rights for the slaves. There they are: Sabbath rest, sabbatical year, right to life, and they could be freed if they were injured. So let's look at those specific rights one at a time. First of all, the Sabbath rest. So it's in the Ten Commandments. Exodus 20 and verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is with you. So notice it specifically includes the male servant and the female servant as people who must be given rest on the Sabbath day. So 1 day a week, they had a day of rest. Everybody did, and that included the slave specifically. There's also sabbatical year. So every 7 years, in the seventh year, they didn't do any agriculture. The workload went away, and the slaves weren't allowed to work in those years either. They had a year off every 7 years, rather curiously. Of course, a lot of them were released by that stage, but if you were a genuine slave, you got the sabbatical year when you didn't have to do agricultural work. You have a right to life. Exodus 21 verse 20, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. And being avenged meant, well, if it was deliberate, that would be murder, that would be the death penalty. If it wasn't deliberate, you had to flee to a city of refuge, and you stayed there. So it was a imprisonment up until the rather interestingly, it's a life sentence, but not your life. It's the life of the high priest who is serving at that particular time. When he dies, you can go back again. So the slave has a right to life. There's a tremendous punishment for someone who kills a slave. It does say if the slave survives a day or two, he's not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. But I think what it's saying there is if the slave survives a day or two and then recovers, then you've lost his labor for that time. That's the penalty you suffer, provided it's not seriously injured, because there's an absolute point about killing anybody, no matter who they are. There's a life for a life. If you kill somebody, if you murder someone, then you die, and the slave is included. Injury to a slave led to his release. It talks about if he put his eye out, then he's released immediately. If you knock a tooth out, he's released immediately. It doesn't say how far down the injury goes, but nonetheless, there's this idea that an injury would lead to the release of a slave. So the slaves have rights of various kinds. There's specific rights. And one of the really important rights, the last one, is the right to change his master. go away from the master he's got. So Deuteronomy 23, verse 15, you shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place he shall choose, within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him. So if you mistreated your slave, he could run away. If he ran away, he didn't have to be returned. In fact, they were specifically, you mustn't return him. So he could go. He'd probably have to get another master because he's got to find some way of living. So he'd have to work for somebody else. But nonetheless, he has the right to go away from a master if that master mistreats him. He might lose out in terms of the sort of severance bonus that servants got, bondservants had, but he has the right to change his master. And that makes, to me, the difference between what happens in Israel and the kind of slavery that we used to thinking about. The fact that the slave, the bondservant, could move out and go somewhere else if he felt his position was dreadful. He could find another employer. In fact, the other people couldn't send him back. Right, let's look at individual cases. So there are individual people who were bondservants in Israel. First one of those is a Hebrew who sells himself to avoid poverty. So first thing is that Israel was arranged to look after the poor people. The law was arranged like that. There were all sorts of provisions. You couldn't lend on great interest rates, so you won't become impoverished because of that. If your farm failed, you could take crops from neighboring farms. They took the harvest and they had to leave some in the fields that you could go and harvest. There were all sorts of provisions for the poor. If you had to borrow money from someone, he couldn't take collateral from you. Had to return it at night, so you could still use it. You didn't use anything because it was collateral in a loan. But in the extreme, if none of that worked, the Hebrew could sell himself into care. And what happened is he went to his patron. His patron had to have him work for him, and he had to work for him until the Jubilee. So the calendar work, every seventh year, there's a sabbatical year, is a year off. They didn't cultivate the fields laid fallow. And then after 7 of those, after 49 years, was another one, which was the Jubilee year, the 50th year. And in that year, all the property was returned to its original owner. And the people who were this kind of slave were released in the Jubilee. They would go back to their farm, which by now would have returned to their care. They were given animals. They were given from the threshing floor. They were given grain. They could start up their farm again and keep on going. And so they got all the rights of a bondservant that we saw already: equality of status, humane treatment, the right to change master, and they released on the Jubilee year. It might be a long time off, or it might be almost immediately. It just depends when they go into care. So what you've got really is a law that supports someone who's done so badly, he's gone completely bankrupt. It's not a law to make someone in a slave in the way that we think of slavery. And people might choose to become this kind of bondservant because the alternative was worse. It's not good. You wouldn't want to be a bondservant like that, but it's something that you might choose to do because it was better than starving. It's better than the alternative of extreme poverty. Another example, a Hebrew who sold for debt. So this case, you've now borrowed from somebody, but you've become unable to pay back the debt that's required. And so what happens there is that, again, there are provisions to avoid debt, but if you couldn't repay, then you could be sold into the service. You'd either go and work for the person who owned the debt, or the debt could be sold to somebody else, and the slave would go and work for him. So it appears that this is what happened to you if you stole something. It was discovered that you'd stolen it, and you then had to return some number of times more than what you'd stolen. If you stole a sheep, you had to return 4 sheep. If you couldn't do that, then you would go into this kind of service. And in this case, you had to work until the Sabbath year. So that's the 7th year. So whenever the next 7th year happened, that's when you would be released. And again, you'd be set up with animals and grain. Your farm would be able to work again. Presumably it was worked by the person who you've been sold to in the meantime, or you worked it and gave him the produce. And again, it's all the rights of a bondservant that we saw before: quality of status, human treatment, change his master. So this time we're supporting a debtor. We've got somebody who has got himself badly into debt. It's not making him into a permanent slave. It's supporting him as a debtor. So what about a Gentile slave bought by an Israelite? Well, this is the nasty case. This is the bad case, the one which is most like modern slavery. But it's not quite the same as modern slavery. So the first thing is, well, you couldn't have a slave market in the usual sense. You could go abroad and get a slave from among the nations that are around you, or you could buy from a stranger who was living with you. So someone who is settled with you. So we're not talking about traffickers turning up with a caravan, a load of slaves, selling them off, and then disappearing off somewhere, buying some more, perhaps disappearing off somewhere else to carry on trading. You're talking about buying from someone who is permanently there, which does rather put a problem for the seller of slaves. He's got to be living there, and he's selling someone who he already owns as a slave. Notice that it says it from the nations around about you, or the strangers that sojourn with you, only the foreigners. It's only a Gentile that can sell a slave. So if you buy a slave, you can't sell him. So you can't be a slave trader. You buy a slave who's going to help you work your farm, but you can't then sell him on. If only a Gentile can sell a slave, you, a Hebrew who keeps the law, can't sell a slave. And the person you buy is already a slave. So you've got someone, I think, slaving somebody. You're taking a slave of a Gentile, or you're taking a Gentile who's already a slave, and you're taking him on into your employ, or whatever you want to call it. It becomes part of your household. It's very much emphasizes this idea: someone who's been born in your land. He's talking about a Gentile who doesn't have any land of his own. He's bought in your land, but it's not someone who has been trafficked, which is one of the big problems of slavery. Now, the difference is he doesn't get released. He carries on, and his status is inherited, becomes a possession forever. Word means without limit, basically. And it's considered, it's acknowledged, this is worse than the condition of a Hebrew bondservant. But nonetheless, the slave has some rights. Remember, the law of Moses is very, very consistent in saying there's one law for the stranger and one law for the Hebrew. So the Hebrew, the Israelite, and the foreigner both have to keep the same law, unless there's a specific difference in the way that it's put. So the Gentile who's sold as a slave, first of all, you can only buy from a Gentile. He's there for life, can be inherited, but his rights are the rights of the same as a Hebrew slave, apart from the year of release. There's no point in having him released at the Jubilee. He hasn't got any land to go to. But he has many of the rights of a Hebrew bondservant. Remember, there's a law that specifically says that in Leviticus 19. and he has equality of status, he has the right to humane treatment, he has the right to change his master, but he doesn't have the right to be released on a specific year. So he's better off than he was before when he was the slave of a Gentile, didn't have these rights. Remember, the Gentile doesn't keep the law, but nevertheless, it's not the good thing to be. And I think this is a case where they are regulating something that is going to happen. It certainly makes it quite awkward for the master to be really oppressive to the slave. He can always go somewhere else if he does get oppressed. He's going to be in a position that some Israelites might actually choose as a welfare option. Think of that. Think about this sort of picture of the status of a slave. Here's an example from the Old Testament. So we've got someone called Sheshan, whose genealogy is sufficiently important for him to be included in Chronicles. He's a principal family in Israel, a member of a principal family in Israel, but he's got no sons, he's got daughters. But he's got an Egyptian slave, a foreigner, as a slave. And Sheshan gives his daughter in marriage to his slave. And that continues the line. So he's allowing, one of the principal families of Judah is allowing his daughter to marry one of his foreign slaves. And that continues the family line. Now, imagine that, for example, in the American South before the Civil War, the master of the plantation hasn't got any sons, but he's got a daughter, so he wants the inheritance to carry on through his daughter, so he marries her off to one of his slaves. You can't imagine it happening. It wouldn't happen. It just shows how the status of the slave is so much higher than we're used to thinking of. Okay, there are one or two other issues you get. There's the female war captive. You can't rape her. If you're a Hebrew, you couldn't rape them. You could enslave them. You could only marry them. If you wanted to marry them, you had to wait for a month, get to know them, make sure you really did want to marry them. And when you did marry them, then they had to be treated exactly as though any other wife or Hebrew wife you'd married instead. They had exactly the rights of a wife. So it's not really, well, that slavery didn't really happen to prisoners of war. What happened to them is that they were made to pay tribute. The whole city would pay tribute to the conqueror rather than the individuals being taken away and enslaved. The Assyrians took them away, and the Babylonians took them away, but the Hebrews didn't. They would just conquer the city, and that would then pay taxes, basically. Another one that's interesting, I put it down, a wife with a dowry, but the law in Exodus 21 is quite curious about this. It describes her with the word that normally means a female slave, and you could sell your daughter, and she goes to another family, and what happens there is that she works there for a little while, and then she's married to someone in that family, either the person who set it up in the first place, or it says, or one of his sons, possibly grandsons as well might be included. Often the word just means descendants. And what happens then is she then has all the rights of a wife. They can get divorced, but he can't sell her off as a slave. He can't send her abroad. The various things he can't do to her. He can't treat her as less than another wife if he gets another wife. He must carry on with her rights as a wife in every possible way. So if she does go away, if he doesn't like her, she gets a dowry. She takes it away with her. So she doesn't have any fewer rights than an ordinary wife. And I suspect that this becomes the normal way in which engagements happen. She's a sort of engagement with dowry. It's a fairly binding contract, and she's going to get married sooner or later, and there's a dowry settled as part of that. Now, trafficking for prostitution, that's quite a common reason for slavery or for trafficking. Well, that one is forbidden on pain of death. If you sell your daughter into prostitution, then you die. If you kidnap someone for prostitution, you die. Something you'd only do once, then you'd be killed. And if the daughter decides to do it herself, she dies. So prostitution definitely is not a kind of slavery that is going to prosper. And the last one is kidnap and trafficking. So if we go back to Exodus 21, again, verse 16, it says, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. So one of the main ways of making someone a slave is to kidnap him, go and seize him and kidnap him. That couldn't happen. And if you kidnapped someone, you're going to die. And if you bought someone who was kidnapped, you were going to die. So that's absolutely forbidden on pain of death. So let's summarize what we've seen from the Old Testament. First of all, there are lots of different categories of bondservant in the Old Testament, and they each have slightly different laws. There we go. There's a list of different kinds of slave that you could have, or bondservant you could have under Jewish law, under the law of Moses. The main emphasis of the law isn't the liberty of the person, it's their humane treatment, it's their well-being. And it emphasizes that tremendously. They have a whole load of rights. They have a right of equality of status with the master. They have the right of humane treatment by the master, and they have the right to change master. Some of them were going to be released. Most of them were. But foreign slaves were there in perpetuity, effectively. The important point that keeps on coming up in the law of Moses is, remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Don't think yourself any better than them. Don't treat them badly because you're treating people like yourself. And that's the basis of the way that you're intended to think about your bondservants under the law of Moses. So, general conclusion is the Bible's concerned more with well-being than it is with freedom. And sometimes in an ancient society, a slave was actually better off than a freed man. The freed man might be starving. The slave has to be looked after. The rules for Hebrew bondservants are much more about debt or about the welfare of a very poor person rather than they are about slavery. And of course, Hebrew bondservants had a release date, and they had a considerable set of rights that were given to them to make sure that their time as a slave was not too unpleasant. It wasn't like the kind of slavery that you get later on, the secular slavery of the 19th century or the 18th century, for example. A Gentile slave wouldn't be released, that's clear, but nonetheless he still gets the rights that a slave enjoys, including the ability to change to another master. So the law of Moses does its best to maximize the well-being of the slave or of the bondservant, and that's what it's for. And that's, I think, where we finished talking about slavery. There are other videos on this channel. If you want to see them, suggest you subscribe to the channel. If you want to press the notify button, that will enable you to be notified when we put a new video up. And write in the comments. Tell us what you think of what I've put up here, or other comments on other videos. So thanks for listening, and may God bless you.